Welcome to Psychology 2. Now we're looking at social psychology. James picked up a large trash can and hurled it through the storefront window. Glass exploded all directions, and with the violence of the assault and the loud emergency sirens that started to blare from the store's intercom, James cheered from behind the bandana and covered his nose and mouth and jumped through the now open window, heading to the back of the store. His way was lit by a dim light of the exit sign that was flickering in the glow of a burning police car in the street. James grabbed 4 boxes of basketball shoes before turning and running back towards the front of the store. Others were streaming into the open window now and grabbing whatever they could get their hands on, and James jumped back into the street and heard a sharp clank of metal as something hit the pavement nearby. His eyes started to sting as the smoke from a tear gas canister billowed out and drifted his way. James looked down the street. He saw a phalanx of black-clad riot police advancing toward him, and thousands of other Montreal citizens. On the evening of April 12, 2008, thousands of rioting individuals vandalized and looted 10 stores, threw bottles and bricks at police officers, and damaged 16 police cars, with 5 of those being set on fire. Damage to the police cars was estimated at $500,000. So what was the event that triggered such behavior? This wasn't food insecurity or shortage riots or civil rights demonstrations or even something to do with the pandemic. Of course not. It was 2008. This riot was a result of jubilant fans celebrating the hockey win of the Montreal Canadiens that had won just Game 7 of the first round of the Stanley Cup playoffs. And they were now advancing into the next round. So, is James a violent and aggressive individual? If we focus only on James himself as the cause of his behavior that night, we are left with no other possible conclusion. However, could it also be that he was caught up in something that strongly influenced his behavior? Social psychologist Philip Zimbardo argues that we must look at the situational perspective, what's going on around the person, to understand all behavior, from donating to a charity to riots to suicide terrorism. The situationist perspective studies the way in which people can be goaded by social influences into doing things they're not necessarily consistent with their personalities. In particular, Zimbardo has investigated the relative ease in which ordinary men and women can be incited to behave in evil ways. So what really was the root cause of this 2008 Montreal riot? There are probably several situational factors that are largely to blame. This chapter is going to explore what social psychologists have discovered about the situations you find yourself in that might compel your behavior more than you realize, for good or for evil. So let's get started. And we're going to start really with, what is social psychology? Now, the situationist perspective studies the way in which people can be goaded by social influences into doing things they're not normally or necessarily consistent with their personalities. Social psychology studies the nature and causes of behavior and the mental processes in social situations. So some of the topics that are covered in social psychology include attitudes, how we get them, social perception and how that's formed, social influence and the role that it can play in our own behavior, and group behavior. So let's look at some of these topics briefly. We're going to start with attitudes. Attitudes are comprised of cognitive evaluations of set of circumstances, emotional component, and behavioral tendencies. In other words, we'll look at this breaking it down by the cognitive component, the way in which we think about people, objects, or situations. The emotional component would be the way we feel towards objects, persons, or situations. And the behavioral component are the actions that a person takes in regard to the person, object, or situation. So when we think attitudes, the behavioral and the cognitive tendencies that are expressed by evaluating particular people, places, or things with favor or disfavor. Attitudes are learned and they affect behavior. Attitudes can be changed, but not very easily. So can we predict, is there predicting behavior from any attitudes that can be done? Well, attitudes by definition are definition of attitude implies that our behavior is consistent with our cognitions or our thinking. However, links between attitude A and behaviors B tend to be weak to moderate at best. But there are a number of factors that do influence the likelihood that we can predict behavior from attitudes. And we'll start with specificity. Here what we're talking about is that we can better predict specific behavior from specific attitudes than from global, bigger perspective view. We can also look at the strength of the attitude will influence attitude development, our vested interest, especially a vested interest in the outcome. Accessibility. Accessibility is more about brought easily to mind, something that we can access in our minds more easily. Attitudes with strong emotional impact are more accessible. So in terms of our attitude formations, well, since they're learned and are derived from a cognitive process, conditioning may play a role in acquiring attitudes and can be acquired by observing other people. Parents often reward children for saying and doing things that they agree with their own attitudes. So attitudes can also gain from the approval not just our family, but our peers, and can be formed through our direct experience in the world around us. So as a result of new information or exposure and approval, we are experiencing cognitive appraisal. Now, that's a new term, so let's look at that. Cognitive appraisal. This is where people evaluate information and form or even change attitudes, including stereotypes we might have, on the basis of this new information. Initial attitudes act as cognitive anchors. We judge any new ideas in terms of how much they deviate from our existing attitudes. Accepting larger deviations requires a lot more information in order to change an attitude. So changing attitudes through persuasion. Now, persuasion, we can be persuaded to alter or change our attitude. The elaboration likelihood model describes the way in which people respond to persuasive messages. The first, or the central route, inspires thoughtful consideration of the argument and evidence. The second, or the peripheral route, associates objects with positive or negative cues. Now, there are three peripheral factors. One is the messenger, two is the context of the message, and three is the audience. So if we begin with the persuasive message, research suggests that familiarity breeds content, not contempt. The more we see and hear things, the more familiar and accepting we are of them. The more complex the stimuli, the more likely it is that frequent exposure will have favorable effects. Some strategies that we could be using to persuade. Well, one, product claims that admit their product has a weak point, in addition to highlighting its strengths, are most believable. Secondly, the fear appeal seems to work. Fear appeals are most effective when the audience believes that the risks are serious and the audience members can change their behavior or avert the risks. We use fear persuasion techniques for stopping smoking, for example. What are the risks to smoking, and those fear of those risks can change people's behavior. And then 3, audiences. Audiences are also tend to believe arguments that appear to run counter to the vested interests of the communicator. So if I really am strongly trying to get you to quit, but I say I've struggled with my own quitting of smoking, then that's more believable. Now, the persuasive communicator. Now, persuasive communications are characterized by expertise, trustworthiness, even attractiveness or similarity to their audience. Now, should the message not coincide with the knowledge of one has, they may use one or both of these strategies. And here are the 2 strategies. One is the selective avoidance and selective exposure. People tend to seek communicators whose outlook coincides with their own. So that's the communicator. What about the context of the message? When we are in a good mood, we are less likely to evaluate situations carefully. Agreement and praise are effective ways to encourage others to embrace your view. So the persuaded audience now, well, people with high self-esteem and low social anxiety are more likely to resist social pressure. Now, we might be looking at changing attitudes and behaviors, and we could do this by means of what's known as cognitive dissonance. People are thinking creatures. We seek consistency in our behaviors and our attitudes. This facilitates predictions in life. The more consistent things are, the more we're able to use that as a way of predicting things in the future. Not reliably, but we can set goals. Attitude discrepant behavior, though, behavior that runs counter to what a person actually thinks, a person then needs to change either their attitude or they need to change their behavior to resolve the conflict, or what is also known as effort justification. Effort justification is when people are explaining their behavior just to themselves to make sense of why am I doing this. Now, 2 terms that's worth bringing up because they are related to attitudes and changing attitudes, and they sometimes get mixed up. So we're going to review them, and it is something that is covered quite a lot in social psychology, and that is prejudice and discrimination. Now, we may have certainly heard these terms, but we don't always understand them and how they're different. Prejudice is an attitude towards a group that leads people to evaluate members of that group negatively, even though they've never met them. Now remember though, this is prejudice, so it's cognitive, it's thinking, it's attitude. Prejudice is linked to expectations that members of the target group will behave poorly. So there's the cognitive component, the thinking. The emotional component is that prejudice is associated with negative feelings such as fear, dislike, even hatred. And then the behavioral component, and this is where it's a little tricky, because behaviorally, prejudice is connected with avoidance, aggression, and discrimination. Now, the key link here is, and we'll touch it on now, is that discrimination is negative behavior. They are the actions. Prejudice is the attitude or the thinking. You can't see thinking, but you can see actions, and that's discrimination. This can include our personal actions, and it can include social policies that governments and politicians make. Now, related to these 2, prejudice and discrimination, is the concept of stereotypes. Prejudices about certain groups can lead people to view all members of these groups in the same biased fashion. Some stereotypes are actually positive rather than negative. Attractiveness is positively correlated with popularity, social skills, and sexual experience. Attractive people are more likely to be judged innocent in crimes in mock jury experiments. When attractive people are found guilty, they are given less severe sentences. So what are some of our sources of prejudice? Well, one of the bigger ones is what's known as dissimilarity. People like people who share their attitudes. When people don't share their attitudes, we might feel differently about them. Another reason is competition for resources. Sometimes members of one group feel like they're competing for resources and have reasons to distrust members of a competing group. We can also add social learning. So sometimes children learn from others, especially parents, their prejudice or discriminatory practices. Another way that we can see this build up in terms of prejudice is what's known as information processing, where it's our thinking filters, our cognitive filters, familiarity and things that we know are good, foreign, and things that we don't understand, not good. And then the last component is what is known as social categorizing. It's where we divide the world into us's and them's. Of course, that's going to promote stereotyping and can then therefore support prejudice and discrimination. So how do we reduce prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination? Well, one is through what's known as the intergroup contact theory. And it's a valuable approach to reducing prejudice, essentially by providing people with frequent means of working together with equal status and having common goals. These meetings between intergroup members reduces prejudice, stereotyping, and discrimination. It is certainly more complex than simply working together in a group. However, it is a good and successful when it's worked through. We've started to touch a bit on interpersonal attraction, so we can consider what are some of the factors that contribute to attraction and physical appearance, similarity, and reciprocity. Now, we're going to consider each of these. Let's look at physical appearance. Many aspects of beauty appear to be very culturally based, even cross-cultural. In one study, men found attractive the following qualities: large eyes, high cheekbones, and narrow jaws. Now, there are gender differences in the selection of partner. Women place a greater emphasis on professional status, consideration, dependability, kindness, and fondness for children. Men place a greater emphasis on physical allure, cooking ability, thrift. See the disconnect? So one of the hypotheses associated with attractiveness is what's called attraction similarity hypothesis. The attraction similarity hypothesis, this is where people tend to date people who are similar to themselves in physical attractiveness. The research findings show that people who are involved in committed relationships are most likely to be similar to their partners in their attitudes and cultural attributes. So similarity in attitudes. Well, why do I understand that we should be opposites attract when similarity in attitudes? Well, that doesn't make sense then, if that's what I've heard. Essentially, we are attracted to individuals who are similar to our own backgrounds, and this may include, in part due to proximity, geographic proximity. So one of the other areas that is explored in social psychology is love. How does that happen, and what are the variables? Well, from social psychology, love is a strong positive emotion. And of course, you don't need social psychology to tell you that. They have developed, Sternberg, what's known as a love triangle. Now, really what it is, it's a triangular model of love. And it includes three components: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Now, intimacy refers to a couple's closeness, their mutual concern and sharing of feelings and resources, and they disclose personal things to one another that aren't explored and shared with other people. Passion refers to romance and the sexual feelings, but not just in terms of the sexual act, but the element of romance and the element of caring for one another deeply. And then commitment. This means the decision, deciding to enhance and maintain and work for the relationship. Now, passion is the most crucial in a short-term relationship. Intimacy and commitment are way more important in an enduring relationship. The ideal form of love combines all of these, and it's called the consummate love, or it's romantic love plus commitment. Romantic love is characterized by passion and intimacy. Passion involves fascination, sexual craving, and the desire for exclusiveness. Intimacy involves caring, championing the interests of the loved one, even if it entails sacrificing one's own. Now, evolutionary psychologists, they believe that sexual desire evolved as a means of ensuring mating, whereas romantic love evolved from infant caregiving relationships. Now, we've just come to where we're going to stop in part 1, and we're going to carry on in part 2 with social perception, social influence, and 2 very big topics, or 3, I guess, conformity, obedience, and then we'll look at group behavior. I hope this has been helpful for you, and we'll see you in part 2. Bye now.